All right, today we're going to talk about writing equations from a graph. To write an equation given the graph, first you want to find the maximum and the minimum values. This will help you find the amplitude and the midline. So recall that the amplitude is the maximum minus the minimum divided by 2, and the midline is the average, so the maximum plus the minimum divided by 2. When you get the midline, you're going to draw that on your graph and then circle the 5 key points. So remember, the key points are the period divided into 4 equal parts. Determine if the graph is sine or cosine, and we can determine this using this part right here where it says sine starts on the midline on the y-axis, cosine starts above or below the midline on the y-axis. So then we're going to use the period to help find the b value. Recall that b times the period equals 2 pi is the formula that we use. And then we're going to write the equation by substituting values into a, b, and d for these equations that we have here. So y equals a sine bx plus d, or y equals a cosine bx plus d. So let's go ahead and look at the first graph. So again, first you want to identify the maximum and the minimum points. So here's a maximum and here is a minimum. So the maximum value is at a y value of 1. The minimum is at -5. So if I want to find the amplitude, it's the maximum minus the minimum divided by 2. So that gives us 1 plus 5 divided by 2. So 6 over 2 means we have an amplitude of 3. Now that I know the amplitude is 3, I can find the midline, which is the maximum plus the minimum divided by 2, because midline is in the middle, so think the average. So that gives us -4 over 2, which gives us -2. You could also use, if you know the amplitude, you can use that by counting down from a maximum, 1, 2, 3, and then drawing your midline, or you can count up from a minimum, that value, 1, 2, 3, and find the midline that way as well. Or if you know the midline, you could count up or down to find the amplitude instead of using the formulas. So now that I have the midline, that kind of helps me see if this is going to be a sine or a cosine graph. Because remember, we said that if you look at your y-axis, which is right here, we know that a sine graph starts on the y-axis on a midline, and the cosine starts above and below. So in this case, if we look at this equation here, we are starting on the y-axis on the midline, which tells us this is a sine equation. So we know for our equation, we're going to be using y equals a times the sine of bx plus d. So we already have our a and our b values. We need to find our a and d isn't b. We need to find the b value. So we can find the b value by finding the period. So remember, there's 5 key points in one period. So the key points are where the graph crosses the midline and the max and min. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're my first 5 key points. So that tells me that from here all the way to here is one wave, which is equal to the period of the graph. And so in this case, we get 2 pi for the period. So if the period's 2 pi, to find the b value, we're going to use our equation that b times the period equals 2 pi. So that means b is equal to 2 pi divided by the period. So in this case, 2 pi divided by 2 pi equals 1. So that is my b value. And with that, now I can write my equation. So notice the sine graph goes up instead of down first. If it went down, then we would need to have a reflection with my a value. But since it is going up, we do not. So we have 3 for my a value, and it's positive because the graph goes up, times the sine of b, which is 1, so you don't have to write that 1. So the sine of x, and my d value is -2. So that would be my equation. Now, when we get into pre-calculus, there are actually other equations that we can find because we're going to talk about phase shifts, which is shifting your graph left or right. But since we're in Honors Math 3, we don't have to worry about that right now. If I wanted to find the domain of this graph, remember it repeats or goes on forever. So negative infinity to infinity. And the range, of course, would be your lowest value, so bracket -5 to your maximum, which is 1. So go ahead and pause the video, see if you can do number 2 on your own. When you're done, unpause, and we will check your work. So again, the first things you want to do is find your maximum, which you can see is at 5, and your minimum, which is at 1. With that, we can find the amplitude, so the maximum minus the minimum divided by 2, which gives us 2. And we can find the midline, the maximum plus the minimum divided by 2, which is 3. So I'm going to draw my midline on my graph. So I have my midline at y equals 3. And remember, you should be able to count up from the midline 1, 2, and down 1, 2 to get your amplitude, which happens in this case. The period, so on the y-axis, which is here, we have to determine if it's a sine or a cosine graph. So if we look on the y-axis, we are not starting on the midline, we're starting above the midline, which tells us this is a cosine equation. So y equals a times the cosine of bx plus d. So we have our first key point, that's our second, third, fourth, and fifth. So you can see from here to here is one wave, which equals the period. And again, it is 2 pi, which we just did in the last problem, which tells us our b value is 1. So now I can write my equation. Because the cosine graph is starting above the midline, that tells us we are not using an a value that's negative. If it was starting below, our a value would be negative. So we get y equals our amplitude, which is 2, times the cosine of b, which is 1, so times the cosine of x, plus our midline, which is 3. So this would be one possible equation that we're going to use, and we'll talk about more again later in a different course, pre-calculus. So the domain of this is all real numbers, and the range would be bracket 1 to 5. So from your minimum to your maximum. All right, so I suggest for these next couple to pause the video and do them on your own. When you're done, you can unpause to check your work. So for the first one, our maximum is here, our minimum is here. So the maximum's at 3, minimum's at -5. So the amplitude, maximum minus minimum divided by 2. So 8/2 gives us 4. And the midline is the maximum plus the minimum divided by 2, which gives us -2/2, which is -1. So I'm going to draw that on my graph. So -1 is the midline. And I can count from the midline up 1, 2, 3, 4, and down 1, 2, 3, 4. Just checks my amplitude. It's always a good habit to get into. So for this, on my y-axis, I can see that my graph is starting on the midline, so that means this is a sine graph. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's the fifth key point. It's kind of hard to see what that value is at, so the fifth key point is at 6 pi. So that's the period. So then I'm going to use my equation. B times the period equals 2 pi. So B is equal to 2 pi divided by the period. So in this case, 2 pi divided by 6 pi gives me 1/3. Or, yeah, 1/3. And again, we said that this was a sine graph because on the midline, it starts on the y-axis on the midline. So we get y equals my amplitude, which is 4. The graph's going up, so I don't need a reflection, times the sine of my b value, 1/3 x, and my midline is -1 because we are going down 1. So this would be my equation for my graph. Looking at the next one, same thing. So the maximum is here and the minimum is here. So 6 and 2, which means that the amplitude is the maximum minus the minimum divided by 2, which is 2. And the midline is the average, so the maximum plus the minimum divided by 2, which is 4. And so if I draw my midline on my graph, we get y equals 4, and I should be able to count up 1, 2, and down 2 to get the amplitude, which works. On my y-axis, we are starting not on the midline. So since we're not starting on the midline, we are starting below the midline. That means this is a cosine equation. So we need to find the 5 key points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That tells me from here to here is the first wave, which is at pi/2, which is the period. So b times the period equals 2 pi. So that means that b is 2 pi divided by the period. So 2 pi divided by pi/2. So when you have a fraction divided by a fraction, keep the numerator, change multiplication, and flip the denominator. So this becomes 2/pi. Notice your pi's would cancel out. Because it's multiplication, we can do that. If it was addition or subtraction, we cannot. So 2 times 2 is 4. So that means our b value is 4. Now that I have that, I can write my equation. So y equals a times the cosine of bx plus d. So because my graph is starting below the midline, now I need a reflection. So this would be y equals -2 times the cosine of 4x plus 4. And that would give me my equation. All right, so let's go ahead and look at question number 5. For question number 5, same thing, same process. So my maximum and my minimum. So my maximum is at 3, sorry. And my minimum is at 1. So for the amplitude, it's the maximum minus the minimum divided by 2, which gives us 1. And the midline is the maximum plus the minimum divided by 2, which gives us a midline of 2, which is right there. So that's the midline. And again, you should be able to count up 1 and down 1, which from the midline. So on the y-axis, our graph starts on the midline. So that means this is a sine equation. And if I count my 5 key points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we are at 8 pi. So 8 pi is the period. So then b times the period equals 2 pi. So b equals 2 pi divided by the period. So 2 pi divided by 8 pi gives us 1/4. Now that I have that, I can write my equation. So y is equal to, notice your sine graph goes down first instead of up like a normal sine graph. That means we need to have a reflection. So y is equal to negative, you could put -1 if you want to, but you don't have to. You could just write negative sine, and then our b value is 1/4 times x. If you also want to write that as x/4, that's fine. Just make sure it doesn't look like the x is in the denominator, because sometimes I see students write this, and that's not the same thing. So you can write 1/4 times x, or usually I would like to write x over 4 so it doesn't get confused with being in the denominator. And then our d value is plus 2. So now we have our equation, and that's it. So these next two problems are slightly different, problem 6 and 7. So for these two, says for problem 6 and 7, below the x-axis is negative 2 pi to 2 pi, so that's from here to here. And then it just says, recall that b is the number of cycles from 0 to 2 pi, b in your equation. So this is slightly different because notice that it's not telling us where key values are, because we know that this is 2 pi to negative 2 pi, so that means that these points are going by pi over 2, but you can see that the graph has more than one cycle from 0 to 2 pi, which means that we need to figure out our period from this. So the question is, how do I do that? So let's go ahead and start off with how we've been doing this before. So you have your maximum point, which is at 3, and your minimum, which is at -1. So the amplitude is the maximum minus the minimum divided by 2, which is 2, and the midline is maximum plus minimum divided by 2, which gives us 1. So that is right here. And then you could check your amplitude by counting up 2 and down 2 from the midline, just to make sure it works. Because remember, your graph should always oscillate back and forth between that. So I can see that I have on the y-axis, I'm starting on the midline, which means this is a sine equation. So I have my a and my d values. I need to find my b value, which means I need to find the period. So this would be my first key point, 2, 3, 4, 5. So my key points are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, the problem is I don't know where those key points are, right? Because I don't have anything written on my axis here. I don't know where this point is or this point. So if I don't know that, that means how do I find it? Well, remember when we talked about writing these equations, again, we said that b was the number of cycles from 0 to 2 pi. So if I look at this graph, I have a second cycle here. So that means that our b value would be 2, because there are 2 cycles from 0 to 2 pi. So thus our b value is 2. So if we actually wanted to find the period of this, we would do b times the period equals 2 pi. So that means that the period is equal to 2 pi divided by b, which is 2 pi over 2, which is pi. We technically don't need to find that to write the equation, but I just wanted to show you. So that means that from here to here is pi. So if we were to find the key points, it would be the period divided into 4 equal parts of pi over 4. So it means it's actually going by 1 pi over 4, and then 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and 4 pi over 4 would be pi. I just wanted you to be able to see that. So let's go ahead and pause the video, see if you can do number 7 on your own. When you're done, unpause and we'll check your work. So for this one, our maximum is at, looks like 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and the minimum is right here, which looks like it's at 2. So the amplitude is the maximum minus the minimum divided by 2. And the midline is the average, so maximum plus minimum divided by 2, which gives me 3. And so for this, I can draw my midline. So 1, 2, 3 would be right there. And I can check, I can count up 1 and down 1. So that means my amplitude is correct and my midline is correct. So for this, if I look at the y-axis, and I can see that my graph's not starting on the midline, so that means this is a cosine equation. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is my 5th key point. So there is one cycle from 0 to 2 pi, which of course means that your b value is 1. This one was an easy one, which of course then you can even see in your graph that means that your period is 2 pi. You could also use the equation b times the period equals 2 pi. So the period is 2 pi divided by b. So that's where we get 2 pi divided by 1. So for the equation, we start above the midline, so y equals a positive amplitude, so 1 times the cosine of 1x, and then my d value is plus 3. Of course, we don't need to write those 1, so y equals the cosine of x plus 3. And that is all for writing the equations given a graph.